US Chess Championship 2025 features the best American chess players Fabiano Caruana, Wesley, Levon Aronian, the one and only Hans Niemann in the open section, Alice Lee, and 8-time US champion Irina Krush in the women's section. Round 10, Carissa Yip, 3 times US champion with the latest being last year, playing against Nazi Paikidze, 2 times US champion, although the last time it was 7 years ago. And white starts with e4, Carissa is playing white, c6, d4, d5, Caracan defense, very solid opening for black. It's as if Nazi is saying, okay, I'm gonna play very solid, I'm gonna put the fortress here, and try to break through it. e5, the most popular move for white in these positions. Bishop f5, knight f3, e6. So we have this famous white square black pawn triangle with the bishop outside that pawn chain. Bishop e2, knight e7, developing moves, castle, h6, knight develops to d2, knight d7, c3, and g5. And finally, a move that's not considered very popular in this position, very aggressive move by Nazi. Rook e1, queen c7, a4. Carissa is playing on both sides of the board, bishop g7, knight f1, knight is aiming to the squares e3 or g3, c5. c5, the move that tries to break white's center, and here, unusual response for white. Usually they want to keep those pawns as a chain, but Carissa takes the pawn on c5 and allows black to take the pawn on e5 with the knight. Knight goes to d4, castle, knight g3, putting pressure on the bishop on f5, and bishop goes back to g6. Knight h5. Very annoying knight here on h5, and Nazi decides to get rid of it right away and takes it with the bishop. Bishop takes h5, bishop takes h5, knight goes to d7, attacking the pawn on c5. One of the critical moments of the game. Here, Carissa has 2 choices how to proceed. One is to play b4 with the pawn and protect the pawn on c5. That's very solid, but maybe a little boring option. And the second one, to ignore the threat of black taking the pawn on c5 and playing h4 with starting attack on the king side of the board. And Carissa chooses the second option and plays h4. g4. Now, interesting that in this position, black could have taken the pawn on h4. Probably what Nazi didn't like, if the takes the pawn on h4, then queen jumps to g4. This is pinned, this is under attack. So I'm assuming queen g4 Nazi didn't like, and therefore she played g4, but g4 actually doesn't accomplish anything because g4 still allows white to take the pawn on g4 with the queen and still get the queen on this very nice file g with taking the pawn at the same time. Surprisingly, Carissa takes the pawn with the bishop, which is not the best move. Knight takes c5, and white's position is still a little better, but black do not have any problems. Bishop e3, knight g6, h5, and here the knight should have gone to e5 probably, but I guess Nazi was afraid of the move bishop f4 to pin that knight. And therefore, Nazi decided to play more passively and went knight e7. Knight b5, attacking the queen, queen c6, bishop d4. And now the idea here is to exchange the protector of the king, the bishop on g7, because without that bishop, black's king is very, very weak and vulnerable. f5. Very aggressive move from Nazi. She attacks the bishop on g4. We have bishop f3 and knight e4. And knight got to a very nice square on e4, supported by 2 pawns. Exchange of the bishops on g7, check with the queen, and rook f6. Position is better for white, but not by much. And here comes the move that normally you don't see on grandmaster's level. Knight takes a7. Usually, who cares about those pawns on the edge of the board? You put your knight in a very vulnerable position on a7. But believe it or not, that's actually the best move in this position, and white simply won a pawn. Queen is under attack, so queen d7. And here, another critical moment of the game, white could have just taken the knight on e4 and could have won a pawn. Bishop takes e4, pawn takes e4, rook takes e4, using the pin. Using the pin and winning another pawn, and white could have been 2 pawns up. What Carissa was potentially afraid of is the move knight f5. Knight f5 attacking the queen, and if the queen goes away on the d file, the knight on a7, let's not forget there is a knight on a7, and that would be grabbed by the rook, and black would have an extra piece. But what Carissa probably didn't see, she could have played, in this case, rook g4 check. And that check pretty much saves the rook and saves the knight. So white is just 2 pawns up in an absolutely winning position. So Carissa didn't see that, or decided she didn't wanna do this, and just stepped away with the knight on b5. Knight b5, knight c6, attacking the queen. Queen b6, rook c8, putting the rook on a semi-open file c. Rook d1, queen e7, bishop e2. And here, after this move, white lost every advantage they had. And the reason being, the right plan for black here was to put the king on h8 and then double the queen and the rook on the g file and attack the pawn on g2, and black had a very, very nice and pleasant game. Instead, Nazi played e5. e5, 2 question marks. And that move basically loses a pawn on d5. That's basically that's the main problem with this move. A rook takes d5, and that's what Carissa played, and now she has 2 extra pawns. And the reason that Nazi probably allowed that, because she thought the next move would give her a big counterplay. Knight d4, putting the knight under attack, but attacking at the same time white's queen. And she probably thought that's good. Turns out that the move knight d4 loses the game on the spot. And the reason for that is white can ignore their queen being attacked. And Carissa just, with a brilliant move, takes the knight on d4 with a knight. And what happens is that if black takes the queen on b6, there is knight takes f5 check. And that's a fork. And white gets the queen back and has tons of extra pawns and a winning position. So after knight d4 and knight takes d4, black played queen f7, keeping a threat of taking the queen and the knight. But white simply plays queen b5. In this position, black pretty much is lost, but they could have taken the knight on d4. Nazi didn't even do that. She played knight d6, attacking the queen again. But white simply took the knight on d6. Rook takes d6. Queen takes e5 check. Rook f6. And knight takes f5 check using the pin the rook is pinned and cannot take the knight on f5. We can easily see that white have pretty much deciding material advantage. Four, count them, four extra pawns, and also a bishop and a knight against the rook, which is also better. King h7, knight d6, that's another fork, attacking the queen, attacking the rook. Too much extra material. Nazi Paikidze resigned. And now Carissa Yip got 7 points out of 10 after a pretty slow start to the tournament. 8-time US champion Irina Krush is playing against Tatev Abrahamyan. Irina starts with c4, English opening, knight f6, knight c3, g6, e4, d6, d4, bishop g7, and we have King's Indian defense, very popular, played for hundreds of years, one of the most popular openings in chess. Bishop e2, knight a6. Funny looking move, but the idea is to play c5 at some point. But in general, before computers entered the game of chess, knight a6 would be considered a very bad move because it puts the knight on the edge of the board and it only can jump to 4 squares from that spot. Usually, you prefer your knights to be closer to the center of the board on square c6 or d7, where it can control more squares. But computers, again, changed the world of chess, and now knight a6 considered an okay move. Knight f3, castle, bishop e3, developing moves, and e5. This is the main idea, one of the main ideas of King's Indian defense. White do not want to take the pawn on e5. If they take with the knight, exchange of the queens. There is a move here, knight takes e4. And that's the whole idea here. If knight takes e4, bishop takes e5. And this position is pretty much even, so black equalized from the opening, and this is exactly what the idea for black is, to equalize from the opening. d5, that's the main idea of this game for white, to close the center of the board, and they would be marching with their pawns on the queen side of the board, and black will start attacking on the king side of the board with the moves f5, etc. Knight g4, attacking the bishop. Bishop goes away, attacks the queen. f6, bishop h4. g5, attacking the bishop again. Bishop goes back to g3, and we have knight h6. Funny looking knights on the edges of the board on squares a6 and h6. Really looking like anti-chess, to be honest with you. But again, this is a new era of chess, and this is considered to be okay. The next move is f5, opening the position and starting to attack. Knight d2, f5. Now white have to be careful because next move could be f4, and the bishop on g3 would be trapped and lost. Therefore, it's important to prevent this. Irina takes the pawn on f5, knight takes f5, castle, and knight jumps to a very nice square in the middle of the board, in the center of the board, d4. a3, preparing the move b4 with the pawn, bishop develops to f5, and knight goes to a central square, e4. Exchange of the minor pieces on e2, and now the move g4, which is a mistake. Now, the idea here, I guess, was not to allow white to get the queen on a square h5. If it gets to h5, then the pawn on g5 would be under attack by the knight, by the queen. So Tatev decides to not allow Irina to get her queen inside her territory and plays the move g4. And immediately Irina responds with f3. h5, still protecting the pawn on g4, and b4, Irina is playing on both sides of the board. h4, attacking the bishop, not a big problem. Bishop just goes back. Exchange of the pawns, and believe it or not, seems like black are attacking, but in reality, their position is almost lost here, according to the engines. And the reason being that the G file that black tried so hard to open up actually works against them because their king is much more vulnerable than the white's king. Game continues with the move h3. So now white actually have a decision to make whether to take the pawn or not, and Irina decides not to take the pawn at this point and just play bishop d2, queen h4. More pieces are getting into attack, but again, this attack seems fake, and computers value this position as plus 3.5 for white, and we can easily see why in a couple of moves. Bishop and rook g3, pinning the bishop, and very unpleasant, very annoying pin. Rook f7 protecting that bishop, knight g5 attacking the rook, and queen d4 check, king h1, and rook f6. And g-file is actually working against black in this position. Irina plays rook g1 to double the rooks. After exchange of the pawns will happen, queen goes back to h4 and knight e6. The problem for black here is that they cannot take the knight. They can take the knight, but then they cannot take the pawn, because after they take the pawn, white would take on h3, and again g-file will work against them. There would be no way to protect the bishop on g7 from attacks from the rooks. Rook e7, of course, is the move, but white can win in different fashions here. Let's say bishop g5. That would be a double attack on a rook and a queen, winning at least a rook. Or queen g2 is another move that wins the game, because there is no way to protect the bishop on g7, and just in case there is a pawn on b7 also under attack, attacking the queen, the knight and the rook. So black's position is becoming really problematic here. After knight e6, Tatev plays rook g6, and that's basically giving up almost a piece, because what happens is after rook takes g6 and bishop takes g6 and g pawn takes h3, we have this very, very unpleasant for black rook on g1 that attacks the opposition's bishops, and basically there is no long-term defense against this. Yes, queen f6 protects the bishop on g6 for one move, but after h4, it turns out that h5 is a real threat to attack the bishop, and then when the bishop moves away, there would be simply rook takes g7, black plays king h8, knight takes on g7, and here rook g8. Crazy looking move, but in reality is if more natural. Queen takes g7, simply h5. The bishop is pinned, it would be lost, so black are losing a piece anyway. Tatev decides to lose it, so to say, this way. Rook g8 doesn't help, knight e6. White are playing with the extra knight and a much better position, and black resigns after queen e3. Simply not much black can do in this position. Queen h6 is a threat with a check, and look at this position from another angle. White has all the pieces very much coordinated, very much where the game is, and black, not only they are down a piece, but knight on a6 still never entered the game. Very, very bad knight on a6, and maybe that move, knight a6, which I kind of criticized from the very beginning, wasn't that great. Irina won this game, very, very important game in the standings, and let's take a look at the standings, because it's really fascinating. The standings in the women's section is really changing daily. Carissa Yip is the current leader. She is a 3-time US champion, and right now she has 7 points out of 10. Irina Krush, after this win, 8-time US champion, Alice Lee and Anna Sargsyan are trailing by just half a point. And in the last round, Alice Lee will play with Sargsyan, Krush will play with Zatonskih, who is 5th right now, and Carissa Yip plays black against Talia Cervantes. In the open section, only 2 games ended in a draw, and 4 games one of the players won. In the probably most important game, Wesley So was playing against Darius Schwartz, and this is the position on move 70. Wesley So is playing black. He has a rook and the knight against the rook and the knight, but obviously a very important passing pawn on g2. And because of that pawn, black are winning this game. But I wanted to show you a very cute ending here with the move, black to move, and they move the knight to g7. Brilliant move according to the computer, sacrificing the knight. And now if white takes the knight with the rook, then exchange of the rooks and queen, black wins. And if white takes with the knight, then simply queen right away, and black wins again because there are no any discovery checks to win the queen back, and Wesley So won this game. Hans Niemann is playing black against Sam Savian. Hans Niemann has an extra pawn, it's a double one, but still it's an extra pawn, and then he has an absolute monstrous battery of the bishop and the queen, and there is a checkmate on h2 is always a threat, so bishop on g1 has to be glued to the square h2 to protect it. Sam Savian played queen c6, and all Hans Niemann had to do was to take the pawn on c4 with the rook, and basically have 2 extra pawns and convert this winning position. Instead, he decided to play cute and played a rook e3. Rook e3, and the idea is that white cannot take the rook with the bishop because they're gonna get checkmated, queen h2 checkmate. But this is not checkers, you don't have to take the pieces that are offered to you. And what Hans didn't calculate, the move d6. Sam Savian plays d6, and you're asking what's the problem? Bishop takes d6, the checkmate on h2 is still a threat, you still cannot take the rook on e3, but the next move is rook d1, attacking the bishop on d6 with both the queen and the rook, and that becomes a big problem because now the bishop has to step away. Now, if it steps away to, let's say, b8, so there is still that threat here, then white wins with rook d7 check, king f8, rook c8 check, almost a checkmate. The only move, queen e8, and after rook d8, white wins a queen. Therefore, Niemann played bishop e7, Sam Savian simply took the rook on e3 and converted this position with the extra exchange. It was pretty easy conversion. Let's take a look at the standings in the men's section. Fabiano Caruana is the sole leader with 7.5 points, and the only player who can catch him in the last round is Wesley So. Caruana will play black against Levon Aronian. Wouldn't be easy. So will play white against Grigory Oparin. So anything can happen in the last round. If you're still here, thank you. Please do not forget to like the video and subscribe, and write in the comments who, in your opinion, will win the championship.